Time Warner Audiobooks presents Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? By Philip K. Dick. Read by Matthew Modine with Calista Flockhart.
A merry little surge of electricity piped by automatic alarm from the mood organ beside his bed awakened Rick Deckard. Surprised, it always surprised him to find himself awake without prior notice. He rose from the bed, stood up in his multicolored pajamas, and stretched. Now, in her bed, his wife Iran opened her gray, unmerry eyes, blinked, then groaned and shut her eyes again. "You set your pen field too weak," he said to her. "I'll reset it and you'll be awake and—"
Keep your hands off my settings. I don't want to be awake.
He seated himself beside her and bent over. "If you set the surge up high enough, you'll be glad you're awake. That's the whole point. At setting C, it overcomes the threshold barring consciousness, as it does for me." He patted her bare, pale shoulder.
Get your crude cop hands away.
"I'm not a cop." He felt irritable now, although he hadn't dialed for it.
You're worse. You're a murderer hired by the cops.
"I've never killed a human being in my life,"
Just those poor Andys.
Iran said. "I notice you've never had any hesitation as to spending the bounty money I bring home on whatever momentarily attracts your attention." He rose, strode to the console of his mood organ. "Instead of saving so we could buy a real sheep to replace that fake electric one upstairs, a mere electric animal, and me earning all that I've worked my way up to through the years." At his console, he hesitated between dialing for a thalamic suppressant, which would abolish his mood of rage, or a thalamic stimulant, which would make him irked enough to win the argument.
If you dial for greater venom, then I'll dial the same. I'll dial the maximum, and you'll see a fight that makes every argument we've had up until now seem like nothing. Dial and see. Just try me.
She rose swiftly, loped to the console of her own mood organ, stood glaring at him, waiting. He sighed, defeated by her threat. "I'll dial what's on my schedule for today." Examining the schedule for January 3rd, 2021, he saw that a businesslike, professional attitude was called for. "If I dial by schedule," he said, "will you agree to also?" He waited, canny enough not to commit himself until his wife had agreed to follow suit.
My schedule for today lists a 6-hour self-accusatory depression,
Iran said. "What? Why did you schedule that? I didn't even know you could set it for that."
I was sitting here one afternoon, and naturally I had turned on Buster Friendly and his friendly friends, and he was talking about a big news item he's about to break. And then that awful commercial came on, the one I hate, for Mountebank lead cod pieces. And so for a minute I shut off the sound. And I heard the building. This building. I heard the...
She gestured. "Empty apartments?" Rick said. Sometimes he heard them at night when he was supposed to be asleep. Out in what had been before the war the suburbs, one could find buildings entirely empty, or so he had heard.
At that moment,
Iran said,
when I had the TV sound off, I was in a 382 mood. I'd just dialed it. So although I heard the emptiness intellectually, I didn't feel it. But then I realized how unhealthy it was, sensing the absence of life, not just in this building, but everywhere, and not reacting. Do you see? I guess you don't. But that used to be considered a sign of mental illness. They called it absence of appropriate affect. So I left the TV sound off, and I sat down at my mood organ, and I experimented. And I finally found a setting for despair.
Her dark, pert face showed satisfaction, as if she had achieved something of worth.
So I put it on my schedule for twice a month. I think that's a reasonable amount of time to feel hopeless about everything, about staying here on Earth after everybody who's smart has emigrated. Don't you think?
"But a mood like that," Rick said, "you're apt to stay in it, not dial your way out."
I program an automatic resetting for 3 hours later.
His wife said.
A 481. New hope that...
"I know 481. Listen, even with an automatic cutoff, it's dangerous to undergo a depression. Forget what you've scheduled and I'll forget what I've scheduled. We'll dial a 104 together and both experience it. And then you stay in it while I reset mine for my usual businesslike attitude. That way, I'll want to hop up to the roof and check out the sheep and then head for the office. Meanwhile, I'll know you're not sitting here brooding with no TV. He released her slim, long fingers, passed through the spacious apartment to the living room, where he bent to turn on the TV. From the bedroom, Iran's voice came.
I can't stand TV before breakfast.
Dial 888, Rick said. The desire to watch TV no matter what's on.
I don't feel like dialing anything at all now.
Then dial 3.
I can't dial a setting that stimulates my cerebral cortex into wanting to dial. If I don't want to dial, I don't want to dial that most of all, because then I will want to dial, and wanting to dial is right now the most alien drive I can imagine. I just want to sit here on the bed and stare at the floor.
Rick turned up the TV sound, and the voice of Buster Friendly boomed out. Well, ho, 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 folks. Time now for a brief note on today's weather. The Mongoose satellite reports that fallout will be especially pronounced toward noon, and then will taper off. So all you folks who'll be venturing out. Appearing beside him, Iran shut off the TV set.
Okay, I give up. I'll dial. Anything you want me to be. Ecstatic sexual bliss. I feel so bad I'll even endure that. What the hell? What difference does it make?
I'll dial for both of us, Rick said, and led her back into the bedroom. There, at her console, he dialed 594, pleased acknowledgement of husband's superior wisdom in all matters. On his own console, he dialed for a creative and fresh attitude toward his job, although this he hardly needed. Such was his habitual, innate approach without recourse to Penfield artificial brain stimulation. After a hurried breakfast, he ascended, clad for venturing out, including his Ajax model Montebank lead codpiece, to the covered roof pasture whereon his electric sheep grazed, whereon it, sophisticated piece of hardware that it was, chomped away in simulated contentment, bamboozling other tenants of the building. Of course, some of their animals undoubtedly consisted of electronic circuitry fakes too. The morning air, spilling over with radioactive motes, gray and sun-beclouding, belched about him. He sniffed involuntarily the taint of death. Well, that was too strong a description for it, he decided. The legacy of World War Terminus had diminished in potency. Those who could not survive the dust had passed into oblivion years ago, and the dust, weaker now in confronting the strong survivors, only deranged minds and genetic properties. Despite his lead codpiece, the dust undoubtedly filtered in and at him. So far, medical checkups taken monthly confirmed him as a regular, a man who could reproduce within the tolerances set by law. Any month, however, the exam could reveal otherwise. Continually, new specials came into existence, created out of regulars by the omnipresent dust. The saying, currently blabbed by posters, TV ads, and government junk mail, ran, "Immigrate or degenerate. The choice is yours." Very true, Rick thought as he opened the gate to his little pasture and approached his electric sheep. But I can't immigrate, because of my job. The owner of the adjoining pasture, his Connaught neighbor Bill Barber, hailed him. "My horse," Barber declared, "is pregnant." He indicated the big Percheron which stood staring off into space. "What do you say to that?" "I say pretty soon you'll have 2 horses." Rick had reached his sheep now. It lay ruminating, alert eyes fixed on him in case he had brought any rolled oats. The alleged sheep contained an oat tropic circuit. At the sight of such cereals, it would scramble up convincingly and amble over. "What's she pregnant by?" he asked. "The wind?" "I bought some of the highest quality fertilizing plasma available in California," Barber informed him, "through inside contacts I have with the State Animal Husbandry Board." "Ever thought of selling your horse?" Rick asked. He wished to God he had a horse, in fact any animal. Owning and maintaining a fraud had a way of gradually demoralizing one, and yet from a social standpoint it had to be done, given the absence of the real article. "It would be immoral to sell my horse," Barber said. "Sell the colt then. Having 2 animals is more immoral than not having any." "How do you mean?" A lot of people have 2 animals, even 3. Exploring in his coat pockets, Rick found his creased, much-studied copy of Sydney's Animal and Fowl Catalog January supplement. He looked in the index, found colts, and presently had the prevailing national price. "I can buy a Percheron colt from Sydney's for $5,000, he said. "No, you can't. Look at the listings again. It's in italics. That means they don't have any in stock, but that would be the price if they did." "Suppose," Rick said, "I pay you $500 a month for 10 months, full catalog value." "Deckard, you don't understand about horses. There's a reason why Sydney's doesn't have any Percheron colts in stock. Percheron colts just don't change hands, at catalog value even. They're too scarce." "But," Rick interrupted, "for you to have 2 horses and me none, that violates the whole basic theological and moral structure of Mercerism." "Well, you have your sheep. Hell, you can follow the ascent in your individual life, and when you grasp the 2 handles of empathy, you approach honorably. Now, if you didn't have that old sheep there, I'd see some logic in your position. Sure, if I had 2 animals and you didn't have any, I'd be helping deprive you of the true fusion with Mercer. But every family in this building has an animal of some sort." Going over to his sheep, Rick bent down, searching in the thick white wool. The fleece, at least, was genuine, until he found what he was looking for, the concealed control panel of the mechanism. He snapped open the panel covering. "See? You understand now why I want your colt so badly." "Well, you poor guy. Has it always been this way?" "No, I had a real sheep originally. My wife's father gave it to us outright when he immigrated. Then about a year ago, remember that time I took it to the vet? You were up here that morning when I came out and found it lying on its side and it couldn't get up." "You got it to its feet," Barbara said. "But then after a minute or 2 of walking around, it fell over again." "Sheep get strange diseases," Rick said. "Tetanus. That's what mine died of. Tetanus." "Up here?" Barbara said. "On the roof?" "The hay," Rick explained. "That one time I didn't get all the wire off the bale. I left a piece and Groucho, that's what I called him then, got a scratch and contracted tetanus. I took him to the vets and he died. And I thought about it, and finally I called one of those shops that manufacture artificial animals, and I showed them the photograph of Groucho. They made this." He indicated the reclining ersatz animal. "It's a premium job, but..." He shrugged. "Well, it's just not the same," Barbara finished. "But almost. You feel the same doing it. You have to keep your eye on it exactly as you did when it was alive, because they break down, and everyone in the building knows. I've had it at the repair shop 6 times. The repair outfit's truck is of course marked Animal Hospital something, and the driver dresses like a vet, completely in white." He glanced suddenly at his watch, remembering the time. "I have to get to work," he said. "I'll see you this evening." As he started toward his car, Barbara called after him. I won't say anything to anybody here in the building." "I don't know," Rick said. "Maybe it doesn't make any difference." "But they'll look down on you. Not all of them, but some. You know how people are about not taking care of an animal. They consider it immoral and anti-empathic. I mean, technically it's not a crime like it was right after WWT, but the feeling's still there." "God," Rick said, "I want to have an animal. I keep trying to buy one, but on my salary, on what a city employee makes." "Well, you could buy a cat. Cats are cheap. Look in your Sydney's catalog." "I don't want a domestic pet," Rick said. "I want what I originally had, a large animal, a sheep, or if I could get the money, a cow or a steer, or what you have, a horse." The bounty from retiring 5 Andes would do it, he realized. But, he thought, the 5 Andes first have to make their way to Earth from one of the colony planets. I can't control that. And even if I could, the Andes would specifically have to take up residence in Northern California. "Buy a cricket," Barbara suggested. "Or a mouse. Hey, for $25 you can buy a full-grown mouse." "Your horse could die," Rick said, "like Groucho died, without warning." He strode off, car key in his hand. "Sorry if I offended you," Barbara said. In silence, Rick Deckard plucked open the door to his hover car. He had nothing further to say to his neighbor. His mind was on his work, on the day ahead. In a giant, empty, decaying building which had once housed thousands, a single TV set hawked its wares to an uninhabited room. The ownerless ruin had, before World War terminus, been tended and maintained. Here had been the suburbs of San Francisco. No one today remembered why the war had come about or who, if anyone, had won. The dust, which had contaminated most of the planet's surface, had originated in no country, and no one, even the wartime enemy, had planned on it. First, strangely, the owls had died. After the owls, of course, the other birds followed, but by then the mystery had been grasped and understood. A meager colonization program had been underway before the war, but now that the sun had ceased to shine on Earth, the colonization entered an entirely new phase. In connection with this, a weapon of war, the synthetic freedom fighter, had been modified. Able to function on an alien world, the humanoid robot, strictly speaking, the organic android, had become the mobile donkey engine of the colonization program. Under UN law, each immigrant automatically received possession of an android subtype of his choice, and by 2019 the variety of subtypes passed all understanding, in the manner of American automobiles of the 1960s. The UN had made it easy to immigrate, difficult if not impossible to stay. Loitering on Earth potentially meant finding oneself abruptly classed as biologically unacceptable. Once pegged as special, a citizen, even if accepting sterilization, dropped out of history. He ceased, in effect, to be part of mankind, and yet thousands of individuals remained, most of them constellated in urban areas where they could physically see one another, take heart at their mutual presence. Those appeared to be the relatively sane ones, and, in dubious addition to them, occasional peculiar entities remained in the virtually abandoned suburbs. John Isidore, being yammered at by the television set in his living room as he shaved in the bathroom, was one of these. "I wonder if I'm late for work," Isidore wondered. He did not own a working clock. Generally, he depended on the TV for time signals, but today was Interspace Horizon Day, evidently. Anyhow, the TV claimed this to be the 5th or 6th anniversary of the founding of New America, the chief U.S. settlement on Mars, and his TV set, being partly broken, picked up only the channel which had been nationalized. The government in Washington, with its colonization program, constituted the sole sponsor which Isidore found himself forced to listen to. "Let's hear it from Miss Maggie Klugman," the TV announcer suggested. A recent immigrant to Mars, Mrs. Klugman, in an interview taped live in New York, had this to say. "Miss Klugman, how would you contrast your life on contaminated Earth with your new life here?"
I think what I and my family of 3 noticed most was the dignity.
"Back on Earth, Miss Klugman, in the old days, did you also worry about finding yourself classified as special?"
Oh, my husband and myself worried ourselves nearly to death. Of course, once we emigrated, that worry vanished. Fortunately, forever.
To himself, John Isidore thought acidly, "And it's gone away for me, too, without my having to immigrate." He had been a special now for over a year, and not merely in regard to the distorted genes which he carried. Worse still, he had failed to pass the minimum mental faculties test, which made him, in popular parlance, a chickenhead. Upon him the contempt of 3 planets descended. However, despite this, he survived. He had his job, driving a pickup and delivery truck for a false animal repair firm. His boss accepted him as human, and this he appreciated. Having finished shaving, Isidore strode into the living room and shut off the TV set. Silence. It flashed from the woodwork and the walls. It smote him with an awful total power. As he stood by the inert TV set, he experienced the silence as visible and, in its own way, alive. Alive. He wondered if the others who had remained on Earth experienced the void in this way. But whom could he compare notes with? He lived alone in this deteriorating, blind building of 1,000 uninhabited apartments, which, like all its counterparts, fell, day by day, into greater entropic ruin. "Okay," he thought, "I'm off to work." He reached for the doorknob that opened the way into the unlit hall, then shrank back as he glimpsed the vacuity of the rest of the building. It lay in wait for him. Out here, the force which he had felt busily penetrating his specific apartment. God, he thought, and reshut the door. He was not ready for the trip up those clanging stairs to the empty roof where he had no animal. The echo of himself ascending, the echo of nothing. Time to grasp the handles, he said to himself, and cross the living room to the black empathy box. When he turned it on, the usual faint smell of negative ions surged from the power supply. He breathed in eagerly, already buoyed up. Then the cathode ray tube glowed like an imitation, feeble TV image. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he grasped the twin handles. The visual image congealed. He saw at once a famous landscape, the old brown barren ascent, with tufts of dried-out bone-like weeds poking slantedly into a dim and sunless sky. One single figure toiled its way up the hillside, an elderly man wearing a dull, featureless robe. The man, Wilbur Mercer, plodded ahead, and as he clutched the handles, John Isidore gradually experienced a waning of the living room in which he stood. He found himself, instead, as always before, entering the landscape of drab hill, drab sky. At the same time, he no longer witnessed the climb of the elderly man. His own feet now scraped, sought purchase among the familiar loose stones. He once again smelled the acrid haze of the sky, not Earth's sky, but of some place, alien, distant, and yet, by means of the empathy box, instantly available. He had crossed over, in the usual perplexing fashion, physical merging, accompanied by mental and spiritual identification with Wilbur Mercer, had reoccurred, as it did for everyone who at this moment clutched the handles, either here on Earth or on one of the colony planets. He experienced them, the others, incorporated the babble of their thoughts. They, and he, cared about one thing, the climb, the need to ascend. Today we are higher than yesterday, and tomorrow, he, Wilbur Mercer, glanced up at the view of the ascent ahead. Impossible to make out the end, too far, but it would come. A rock, hurled at him, struck his arm. He felt the pain. Who, he wondered, peering to see his tormentor? The old antagonists, manifesting themselves at the periphery of his vision. It, or they, had followed him all the way up the hill, and they would remain until at the top. He remembered the top, the sudden leveling of the hill, when the climb ceased and the other part of it began. God, he thought in weariness, in what way is this fair? Why am I here alone like this, tormented by something I can't even see? And then, within him, the multiple babble of everyone else in the fusion broke the illusion of aloneness. You felt it too, he thought. Yes, the voices answered. We got hit, on the left arm. It hurts like hell. Once, he remembered, it had been different. Back before the curse had come, an earlier, happier part of life. They, his foster parents, Frank and Cora Mercer, had found him floating on an inflated rubber air rescue raft off the coast of New England. Or had it been Mexico? He did not now remember the circumstances. Childhood had been nice. He had loved all life, especially the animals, had in fact been able for a long time to bring dead animals back as they had been. But the killers had arrested him as a freak, more special than any of the other specials, and everything had changed. Local law prohibited the time reversal faculty by which the dead returned to life. They had spelled it out to him during his 16th year. He continued for another year to do it secretly, in the still remaining woods. But an old woman, whom he had never seen or heard of, had told. Without his parents' consent, they, the killers, had bombarded the unique nodule which had formed in his brain, had attacked it with radioactive cobalt, and this had plunged him into a different world. It had been a pit of corpses and dead bones, and he struggled for years to get up from it. The donkey, and especially the toad, the creatures most important to him, had vanished, had become extinct. Only rotting fragments remained. At last a bird, which had come there to die, told him where he was. He had sunk down into the tomb world. How long that part of the cycle had lasted he did not know. Anyhow, he was no longer sinking. He had begun to ascend along with the others. Long ago he had lost sight of them. He found himself evidently climbing alone. But they were there, and he felt them, strangely, inside him. Isidore stood holding the two handles, experiencing himself as encompassing every other living thing, and then, reluctantly, he let go. It had to end, as always. Using a Kleenex, he dried his damaged arm and heard, muffled and far off, a TV set. It's someone else in the building, he thought wildly, unable to believe it. Not my TV. That's off. It's below, on another level entirely. I'm not alone here anymore, he realized. Another resident has moved in, taken one of the abandoned apartments, and close enough for me to hear him. Let's see, he thought rapidly. What do you do when a new resident moves in? On his way to work, Rick Deckard, as Lord knew how many other people, stopped briefly in front of one of San Francisco's larger pet shops along Animal Row. In the center of the block-long display window, an ostrich, in a clear plastic cage, returned his stare. Rick spent a few more minutes staring grimly at the price tag. He then continued on to the Hall of Justice on Lombard Street and found himself a quarter of an hour late for work. As Rick unlocked his office door, his superior, Police Inspector Harry Bryant, jug-eared and red-headed, hailed him. "Meet me at 9:30 at Dave Holden's office." Inspector Bryant flicked briefly through a clipboard of onion-skin-typed sheets. "Holden is at Mount Zion Hospital with a laser track through his spine. He'll be there for a month at least, until they can get one of those new organic plastic spinal sections to take hold." "What's happened?" Rick asked, chilled. The department's chief bounty hunter had been all right yesterday. Bryant muttered over his shoulder something about 9:30 in Dave's office and departed. As he entered his own office, Rick heard the voice of his secretary, Ann Marston, behind him.
Mr. Deckard, you know what happened to Mr. Holden? He got shot.
"Yeah?" he responded absently.
It must have been one of those new extra clever Andys the Rosen Association is turning out. Did you read over the company's new brochure? The Nexus 6 brain unit is capable of selecting within a field of 2 trillion constituents, or 10 million separate neural pathways. You missed the vid call this morning. Miss Wilde told me. It came through the switchboard exactly at 9.
"A call-in?" Rick asked.
A call out by Mr. Bryant to the WPO in Russia, asking them if they would be willing to file a formal written complaint with the Rosen Association's factory representative east.
Harry still wants the Nexus 6 brain unit withdrawn from the market? He felt no surprise. Since the initial release of its specifications and performance charts, most police agencies which dealt with escaped Andys had been protesting. "The Soviet police can't do anything more than we can," he said. Legally, the manufacturers of the Nexus 6 brain unit operated under colonial law, their parent auto factory being on Mars.
Want to know what the Russian police said?
Miss Marston asked.
I know that, too.
Her freckled orange face glowed. "I'll find out from Harry Bryant," Rick said. Seating himself at his desk, he pointedly fished about in a drawer until Miss Marston, perceiving the hint, departed. From the drawer, he produced an ancient, creased manila envelope. He rummaged among the contents of the envelope until he came across what he wanted, the collected extant data on the Nexus 6. A moment's reading vindicated Miss Marston's statement. The Nexus 6 android type surpassed several classes of human specials in terms of intelligence. But new scales of achievement, for example the Voight-Kamp empathy test, had emerged as criteria by which to judge. An android, no matter how gifted as to pure intellectual capacity, could make no sense out of the fusion which took place routinely among the followers of Mercerism, an experience which he, and virtually everyone else, managed with no difficulty. He had wondered, as had most people, precisely why an android bounced helplessly about when confronted by an empathy-measuring test. Empathy, evidently, existed only within the human community, whereas intelligence to some degree could be found throughout every phylum and order. For one thing, the empathic faculty probably required an unimpaired group instinct. A solitary organism, such as a spider, would have no use for it. In fact, it would tend to abort a spider's ability to survive. It would make him conscious of the desire to live on the part of his prey. Ultimately, the empathic gift blurred the boundaries between hunter and victim. Evidently, the humanoid robot constituted a solitary predator. Rick liked to think of them that way. It made his job palatable. In retiring, i.e. killing, an Andy, he did not violate the rule of life laid down by Mercer. "You shall kill only the killers," Mercer had told him the year empathy boxes first appeared on Earth. And in Mercerism, as it evolved into a full theology, the concept of the killers had grown insidiously. In Mercerism, an absolute evil plucked at the threadbare cloak of the tottering, ascending old man, but it was never clear who this evil presence was. A Mercerite sensed evil without understanding it. Put another way, a Mercerite was free to locate the nebulous presence of the killers wherever he saw fit. For Rick Deckard, an escaped humanoid robot which had killed its master, which had been equipped with an intelligence greater than that of many human beings, which had no regard for animals, which possessed no ability to feel empathic joy for another life's form's success or grief at its defeat, that for him epitomized the killers. "I see you brought the poop sheet on the new brain unit," Inspector Bryant said, hanging up the vidphone. "Yeah," Rick said. "I heard about it on the grapevine. How many Andys are involved, and how far did Dave get?" 8 to start with. Dave got the first 2. "And the remaining 6 are here in Northern California?" "As far as we know, Dave thinks so. That was him I was talking to. I have his notes." "I have nothing on my agenda," Rick offered. "I'm ready to take over in Dave's place." Dave used the Void Camp scale in testing out the individuals he suspected. You realize that this test isn't specific for the new brain units. No test is. Dave considered it accurate. Maybe it is. But I would suggest this. Before you take out after these 6, he tapped the pile of notes, fly to Seattle and talk to the Rosen people. Have them supply you a representative sampling of types employing the new Nexus 6 unit. "And put them through the Void Kampf?" Rick said. "I think I'll talk to the Rosen organization myself, while you're on the way," Bryant said. "I'm going to discuss the possibility of including several humans, as well as their new androids, but you won't know. It'll be my decision, in conjunction with the manufacturers. It should be set up by the time you get there." He abruptly pointed at Rick, his face severe. "This is the first time you'll be acting as a senior bounty hunter. Dave knows a lot. He's got years of experience behind him." "So have I," Rick said. "You've handled assignments devolving to you from Dave's schedule. He's always decided exactly which ones to turn over to you. But now you've got 6 that he intended to retire himself, one of which managed to get him first. This one." Bryant turned the notes around so that Rick could see. "Max Polakov. That's what it calls itself anyhow, assuming Dave was right. Everything is based on that assumption, this entire list. And yet the Void Comp scale has only been administered to the first 3, the 2 Dave retired, and then Polakov. It was while Dave was administering the test. That's when Polakov lasered him." "Which proves Dave was right," Rick said. "Otherwise, Polakov would have no motive." "You get started for Seattle," Bryant said. "Don't tell them first. I'll handle it. Listen, when you run the Void Comp scale up there, if one of the humans fails to pass it—" "That can't happen," Rick said. "One day, a few weeks ago, I talked with Dave about exactly that. I had a memo from the Soviet police, WPO itself. A group of psychiatrists in Leningrad have approached the WPO with the following proposition. They want the latest and most accurate personality profile used in determining the presence of an android. In other words, the Void Comp scale, applied to a carefully selected group of schizoid and schizophrenic human patients. Those, specifically, which reveal what's called a flattening of effect. You've heard of that?" "That's specifically what the scale measures," Rick said. "Then you understand what they're worried about. The Leningrad psychiatrists think that a small class of human beings could not pass the Void Comp scale. If you tested them in line with police work, you'd assess them as humanoid robots. You'd be wrong, but by then they'd be dead." "But these individuals," Rick said, "they'd all be in institutions," Brian agreed. "They couldn't conceivably function in the outside world. They certainly couldn't go undetected as advanced psychotics, unless, of course, their breakdown had come recently and suddenly and no one had gotten around to noticing. But this could happen." 1,000,000 to 1 odds, Rick said, but he saw the point. "What worried Dave," Bryant continued, "is this appearance of the new Nexus 6 type. The Rosen organization assured us that the Nexus 6 could be delineated by standard profile tests. We took their word for it. Now we're forced, as we knew we would be, to determine it on our own. That's what you'll be doing in Seattle. You understand that this could go wrong either way. If you can't pick out all the humanoid robots, then we have no reliable analytical tool and will never find the ones who are already escaping. If your scale factors out a human subject, identifies him as an android, Bryant beamed at him icily, it would be awkward. He picked the phone up. You want to get started? Use a department car and fuel yourself at our pumps. When he landed the police department hover car on the roof of the Rosen Association building in Seattle, he found a young woman waiting for him. Black-haired and slender, she approached his car, her hands deep in the pockets of her brightly striped long coat.
I'm Rachel Rosen. I guess you're Mr. Deckard.
This is not my idea, he said.
Yes, Inspector Bryant told us that. Is it true, Mr. Deckard, that you're a bounty hunter?
He shrugged, with reluctance, nodded.
You have no difficulty viewing an android as inert.
Rachel Rosen said.
So you can retire it, as they say.
Do you have the group selected for me? I'd like to. He broke off because all at once he had seen their animals. A major manufacturer of androids, he said thoughtfully, invests its surplus capital on living animals?
Look at the owl,
Rachel Rosen said.
Here, I'll wake it up for you.
She started toward a small, distant cage. There are no owls, he started to say. Sydney's, he thought. They listed in their catalog as extinct. It's artificial, he said.
No.
She smiled. But Sydney's listing.
We don't buy from Sydney's or from any other animal dealer. All our purchases are from private parties, and the prices we pay aren't reported.
For a long time he stood gazing at the owl, who dozed on its perch. If you sold your owl, he said, how much would you want for it, and how much of that down?
We would never sell our owl. And even if we sold it, you couldn't possibly pay the price.
Breaking away from the sight, it made absolute bitterness blend throughout his prior reaction of awe and yearning. He said, I'd like to test out the selection now. Can we go downstairs?
My uncle took the call from your superior. Uncle Eldon should have an android group and a control group set up by now. So let's go.
She strode toward the elevator, hands again thrust violently in the pockets of her coat. She did not look back. What have you got against me? He asked as they descended.
Well,
she said.
You, a little police department employee, are in a unique position. Know what I mean?
She gave him a malice-filled, sidelong glance. How much of your current output, he asked, consists of types equipped with the Nexus 6?
All,
Rachel said. I'm sure the Void Camp scale will work with them, he said.
And if it doesn't, we'll have to withdraw all Nexus 6 types from the market.
Her black eyes flamed up. She glowered at him as the elevator ceased descending and its doors slid back.
Because you police departments can't do an adequate job in the simple matter of detecting the minuscule number of Nexus 6s who balk.
A man, dapper and lean and elderly, approached. I'm Eldon Rosen, he explained as they shook hands. Listen, Deckard, you realize we don't manufacture anything here on Earth, right? We can't just phone down to the production and ask for a diverse flock of items. It's not that we don't want or intend to cooperate with you. Anyhow, I've done the best that I can. Indicating his department briefcase, Rick said, I'm ready to start. The senior Rosen's nervousness buoyed up his own confidence. They're afraid of me, he realized. I can probably force them to abandon manufacture of their Nexus 6 types. What I do during the next hour could conceivably determine the future of the Rosen Association here in the United States, in Russia, and on Mars. I wouldn't worry if I were you, Rick said as the two Rosens led him into a chic, living room-ish cubicle. From his briefcase, he fished out the Voight-Kampf apparatus and began to assemble the rather simple polygraphic instruments. You may send the first testee in, he informed Eldon Rosen, who looked more haggard than ever.
I'd like to watch,
Rachel said.
I've never seen an empathy test being administered. What do those things you have there measure?
This, he held up a flat adhesive disc with its trailing wires, measures capillary dilation in the facial area. We know this to be a primary autonomic response, the so-called shame or blushing reaction to a morally shocking stimulus. It can't be controlled voluntarily, as can skin conductivity, respiration, and cardiac rate. He showed her the other instrument, a pencil beam light. This records fluctuations of tension within the eye muscles. Simultaneous with the blush phenomenon, there generally can be found a small but detectable movement of...
And these can't be found in androids?
They're not engendered by the stimuli questions, no. although biologically they exist, potentially.
Give me the test.
Why? Rick said. We selected her as your first subject, Eldon Rosen said. She may be an android. We're hoping you can tell. The small beam of white light shone steadily into the left eye of Rachel Rosen, and against her cheek the wire mesh disc adhered. She seemed calm. Seated where he could catch the readings on the 2 gauges on the Voight-Kampff testing apparatus, Rick Deckard said, I'm going to outline a number of social situations. You are to express your reaction to each as quickly as possible. You will be timed, of course.
Go ahead, Mr. Deckard.
Rachel said, You're sitting, watching TV, and suddenly you discover a wasp crawling on your wrists.
I'd kill it.
Rachel said. The gauges registered almost nothing. He noted that and hunted cautiously for the next question. In a magazine, you come across a full-page picture of a nude girl.
Is this testing whether I'm an android or whether I'm homosexual?
The gauges did not register. Your husband likes the picture, he continued. Still the gauges failed to indicate a reaction. The girl, he added, is lying face down on a beautiful bearskin rug. The gauges remained inert, and he said to himself, an android response, failing to detect the major element, the dead animal pelt. Its mind is concentrating on other factors. Your husband hangs the picture on the wall of his study. He finished, and this time the needles moved.
I certainly wouldn't let him,
Rachel said. Okay, he said, nodding. Now a final question, 2-part. You are watching an old movie on TV, a movie from before the war. It shows a banquet in progress. The guests are enjoying raw oysters.
Ugh,
Rachel said. The needles swung swiftly. The entree, he continued, consists of boiled dog stuffed with rice. The needles moved less this time. Are raw oysters more acceptable to you than a dish of boiled dog? Evidently not. He put his pencil down and shut off the beam of light, removed the adhesive patch from her cheek. You're an android, he said. That's the conclusion of the testing. I'm right, aren't I? She's not an android, the elder Rosen said. I don't believe it, Rick said.
why would we lie?
Rachel said.
If anything, we'd lie the other way.
I want a bone marrow analysis made of you. It can eventually be organically determined whether you're an android or not. It's slow and painful, admittedly, but...
Legally, I can't be forced to undergo a bone marrow test. That's been established in the courts. Self-incrimination.
The issue is not the legality of the bone marrow analysis, Eldon Rosen said to Rick. The issue is that your empathy delineation test failed in response to my niece. I can explain why she scored as an android might. Rachel grew up aboard Salander 3. She was born on it. She spent 14 of her 18 years living off its tape library and what the 9 other crew members, all adults, knew about Earth. Then, as you know, the ship turned back a sixth of its way to Proxima. Otherwise, Rachel would have never seen Earth. Anyhow, not until her later life.
You would have retired me. In a police dragnet, I would have been killed. I've known that since I got here 4 years ago. This isn't the first time the Voight-Kampff test has been given to me. In fact, I rarely leave this building.
What were your instructions, Eldon Rosen asked, if you wound up designating a human as an android? That's a departmental matter. He began restoring his testing gear. Obviously, he added, I was told to cancel further testing, as I'm now doing. If it failed once, there's no point in going on. He snapped the briefcase shut.
We could have defrauded you,
Rachel said.
Nothing forced us to admit you mistested me.
This problem, Rick said, stems entirely from your method of operation. Nobody forced your organization to evolve the production of humanoid robots to a point where we produced what the colonists wanted, Eldon Rosen said. We followed the time-honored principle underlying every commercial venture. We knew the risk we were taking when we developed the Nexus 6 brain unit, but your Voight-Kampff test was a failure before we released that type of android. Your police department, others as well, may have retired, very probably have retired, authentic humans with underdeveloped empathic ability, such as my innocent niece here. Your position, Mr. Deckard, is extremely bad morally. Ours isn't. In other words, Rick said, I'm not going to be given a chance to check out a single Nexus 6. You people dropped this schizoid girl on me beforehand.
We have you, Mr. Deckard.
Rachel Rosen agreed. She smiled. He could not make out, even now, how the Rosen Association had managed to snare him, and so easily. "Your superior, Mr. Bryant," Eldon Rosen said, "will have difficulty understanding how you happened to let us void your testing apparatus before the test began." He pointed toward the ceiling, and Rick saw the camera lens. His massive error in dealing with the Rosens had been recorded. "We can work something out," Eldon said. "There's no need for anxiety." Rachel, leaning toward Rick, said,
How would you like to own an owl?
"I doubt I'll ever own an owl." But he knew what she meant. He understood the business the Rosen Association wanted to transact. Tension of a kind he never felt before manifested itself inside him. "But an owl," Eldon Rosen said, "is the thing you want. I don't think he has any idea."
Of course he does.
Rachel contradicted.
He knows exactly where this is heading, don't you, Mr. Deckard?
Again she leaned toward him, and this time closer. He could smell a mild perfume about her, almost a warmth.
You're practically there, Mr. Deckard. You practically have your owl.
To Eldon Rosen she said.
He's a bounty hunter, remember? So he lives off the bounty he makes, not his salary. Isn't that so, Mr. Deckard?
He nodded.
If you have no test you can administer, then there is no way you can identify an android. And if there's no way you can identify an android, there's no way you can collect your bounty. So if the Voight-Kampf scale has to be abandoned...
"A new scale," Rick said, "will replace it. This has happened before."
Eventually, of course, the Voight-Kampf scale will become obsolete.
Rachel agreed.
But not now. We're satisfied ourselves that it will delineate the Nexus 6 types. And we'd like you to proceed on that basis in your own particular, peculiar work.
She regarded him with intensity, trying to fathom his reaction. "Tell him he can have his owl," Eldon Rosen grated.
You can have the owl.
Rachel said, still eyeing him.
The one up on the roof. Scrappy. But we will want to mate it if we can get our hands on a male. And any offspring will be ours. That has to be absolutely understood.
This book is continued on the other side of the cassette.